Welcome, everyone, and feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Just say hi, where you're from, maybe what you write as well, because we've got a lot of writers coming along. I'm
Great.
Phil. As you can see there, English writing coach. I help multilingual writers, copywriters, content writers, even creative writers to build authority in English, which means you can get clients and build your authority and rates. That's what we want for you to be successful. I love doing that, and I'm here today with a detective, a grammar detective, Mr. Paul Duke. Can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, like Phil, I'm a writer, a hobby writer. Nothing's been paying any bills, but I love to write. I've always loved to write. I'm an English teacher, tutor, and coach, and I predominantly work with academic writers. And I live in Canada on the West Coast in Vancouver, where it's morning. And I'm known as the Grammar Detective because on my YouTube channel, which is called The Grammar Detective, I focus on analyzing grammar in video content. I host a weekly live stream on which people ask me grammar questions and I break it down on the board. And I've made a series called English Weirdness, which is a long form series. It's almost like I describe it as Sesame Street meets the Twilight Zone. It involves little dramatizations, animated grammar explanations. It's fun, and I made that with my students. And the joke is, before I became an English teacher, I actually was a private detective. So it's a way of playing with my former career and making fun of myself. But at the same time, my approach to teaching grammar is what's known as the inductive method, where we take a real example of a sentence or a grammar structure and we analyze it, and we analyze and come to the conclusion of what the structure is what structure is happening in that sentence, as opposed to teaching a rule and then introducing an example. So that's why the grammar detective. Yeah, and it's a fun project that I do on the side, but my main business is working with writers to help them write better essays.
That's great. Such a cool
Yeah.
backstory. It's much cooler than mine, I think. And Paul's YouTube channel is great. Check it out. Loads of grammar explanations and fun videos, like he said on there. Yeah, really looking forward to this. Loads of you here now, nearly 100 people, I think.
Wow.
And yeah, what are we going to talk
Plus,
about today, Paul? Basically, we're going to answer the question about whether writers nowadays should really care about grammar. I guess my
yeah.
opinion might surprise people a little bit on that one, but we'll get to that. We are going to tell you some top tips for actually improving your grammar and some tools that you can use. And definitely stick around to the end because I have an awesome cheat sheet that I'm going to uh, tell you about that is going to be completely free. And I'll tell you how to get that at the end. If you've got questions, ask Paul because he knows much more about grammar than me. So just write your questions into the chat, whether it is about writing, about English specifically, or you've got a very challenging grammar point. I'm sure Paul will be able to point you in the right direction. So get your questions in and we'll ask and answer some of those at the end. Yeah, I'm just looking through the comments as well. We've got people here from Pakistan,
Amazing.
Turkey. That's great. Babatunde, welcome. He's in Nigeria. Jürgen is here from Sweden. Wonderful. Dubai. We are covering. Joanne is here. Welcome. Maryland. Got Libby here from the States. Lovely. All right. Well,
Great.
welcome all. Keep chatting away in the chat and tell us what you're up to. And yeah, let's kick off. Paul,
Yeah, you bet.
is is grammar still important for writers? Here we are in 2023, technological age. Is it important? And if so, why?
Great question. I think that's the big question. My answer is categorically yes. I think grammar is a key essential component of a language, any language. And it's a great question to ask now because of all the AI. And also in the ESL language instruction industry, there has tended to be a movement away from overt grammar instruction. And I was always a little bit worried about that. I think it's important because, and this is sort of my running definition of grammar, and it kind of explains why it's important. Grammar is the architecture or the structure through which we express meaning, and alternatively, through which we interpret meaning. So one grammar structure expresses one meaning, another grammar structure, even if it's very similar, is going to communicate a different meaning. And as communicators, but especially writers, and I'll touch on that in a second, as communicators, our goal is to communicate. What? Our goal is to communicate our thoughts, our ideas, our opinions, our unique ideas and opinions that separate us from other people, but also from machines. So I think grammar is maybe more important now in the age of AI because it's going to individuate us. So it's important because you need to learn how to control the grammar to express the meaning that you're thinking. And it's a challenge because if you're learning English as a second or other language, the grammar you're learning in English may be competing with your existing language grammar structure. But you know, I like the metaphor or the analogy of architecture, because if you think about an architect designing, say, a bridge, now they're not communicating meaning, but they're communicating function. A bridge is designed for a function, right? To carry cars and people, you know, from one piece of land to another over a river or a span of water, let's say. Another architect designs an office tower, and its expression is a place for people to sit at desks and do business. If someone hires the architect to design an office tower and they present to them the blueprint for a bridge, they can't do business in the bridge like they can in an office. It's going to serve a different function. And I think grammar is the same way. It's the structure that communicates the meaning. So if you want to communicate with precision and accuracy and individuation, your uniqueness, you need some command of the grammar in order to do that. And I mean, we can certainly debate and discuss different ways of teaching grammar, but I think it's indisputable that we need it. I mean, try using any language with no grammar. It's not language.
Yeah, I think many, I mean, great ideas. I liked your analogy as well. I think many people, myself included, are a bit wary of grammar first, output second. Like, I think that's why, you know, I thought this would be a good title for this session, and why I wanted to bring you on and chat to you. At the end of the day, it's the output, it's the writing, it's the effect of it that matters. And while we might not need to know all of these high level, you know, professorial terminology in linguistics for grammar, it is certainly important that writers can manipulate the language to actually serve their purpose. I say all the time, language and writing are different, but they're interlinked, and you can't have sort of one without the other. So I mean,
love that idea of.
I'm not. Wouldn't say I'm a grammar lover, but it's definitely something that I think we can all improve and helps us. Sorry, Paul. What were you going to say?
I was going to say I love the idea of manipulation. We can use words like manipulation or control, but the idea is that you develop some ability to some command of the grammar structure, so that it can do your bidding. It can express the idea that you want. And the more grammar skill you have, and again, I agree with you, I'm not talking about terminology like independent clause and so on. That just allows us to discuss grammar. It's language for language. But the more command you have over the grammar structure, the architecture of the language, the more dexterity it allows you to twist and turn the language and make it do your bidding, which is what we love about the master writers. They can create sentences that are shocking and surprising, but express a meaning. So I think it's a worthwhile goal to aspire to. And also, for those learning who have learned other languages, you'll know one of the challenges of learning English is that its grammar is highly irregular, owing to its influence from Latin and French and German and Greek and all these other things. And that makes it hard to learn. But I believe that's also the source of its tremendous beauty, because it doesn't follow its own rules, its own regularity. It allows you to be creative with it. And so the more grammar dexterity you can achieve, you can take full advantage of English's superpower, if you will, which is this irregularity.
And we're seeing
Hard
that
to
more
learn.
and more now, right? More and more
Yeah.
with digital writing and quicker kind of writing. We need to process things in a really fast way.
Yeah.
In the 21st century, I think we're seeing more playing around with grammar and definitely in creative writing too. But let me ask you this, Paul. Why do you think grammar is particularly important for multilingual writers, people whose first language is not English, but they're using English to write?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's kind of two pieces to that I would offer, which is one, it's useful to remember that writing, written communication of any kind, has a higher obligation than spoken language for accuracy.
Sure.
Because you basically get one chance to communicate it, right? If you're reading something, if I read something and I don't understand it, I can't ask the author to clarify for me. Whereas if you and I are talking and you say something I don't grasp, I can say, hey, Phil, can you say that a different way or just repeat it? Written language has to get it right once. And also, a writer's goal is to be understood in a way that they want it to be understood, right? You want the reader to interpret, well, let's leave literature out of it, but you want the reader to interpret it the way you intended. So there's a higher responsibility for clarity and accuracy and precision in written English, therefore a need for accuracy and command of grammar.
And I'd say we use one to many. If you're writing and hitting publish on social media, you might be reaching thousands of people. And added to that, sometimes you can't change it.
That's right.
It's a printed newspaper can't be changed. And yes, a lot of digital writing can, but that's why we need a higher standard. Thanks for that, Paul. I'd add as well, just to build on what you said, a lot of the clients that I work with struggle to book gigs, writing jobs, because of people's prejudice against them. Oh, you're not a native speaker, so your worth is less. And of course, we know that's nonsense.
Yeah.
What I would say is that accuracy is the first pillar of building your writing authority. If you submit work which is not accurate, you won't be taken seriously and your work won't be valued as much. So yes, grammar isn't the be all and end all, but it's certainly important to submit accurate work.
Yeah, and as you pointed out, those biases and prejudices, they're real. And you can't necessarily change someone else's prejudice, especially if they hold office of power or authority in the publishing world. But what you can do is minimize them lashing out at you or discriminating against you because of inaccuracies. So it's worth getting those right. The other thing I would add that refers to multilingual writers particularly is that grammar becomes important because they may be tremendous writers in their native language or their first language. But when they learned that, they weren't competing against another language. As children, when we learn our first language, in our case, English, there's nothing else in there. There's just English that we're developing. But when you're learning another language and learning how to write in it, it's being interfered with the structures of your existing language, and sometimes they can be very different. I work with a lot of Asian students, particularly Japanese, and the grammar structure is so vastly different. This becomes an enormous challenge. So they do need to focus on grammar so they can take their ideas, pour them through the English architecture, and end up with the same interpretation that they would if they presented it in their native language. That's a challenge, but that's where grammar becomes something to concern yourself with as a multilingual writer.
Yeah, great points there. There's a lot of crossover in what Paul and I do. We both, work with. Paul works often with academic writers, right? But
Yeah.
yeah, mostly with people who come from different language backgrounds, and yeah, that's something that we both do. So yeah, it's really interesting to chat, and this is a question I can't wait to ask because I like to talk about this too. I think a lot of people here today, correct me if I'm wrong, audience, are probably thinking, what about Grammarly? What about Grammarly, right? I use
Yeah.
Grammarly. It fixes our problems, right? It finds typos. It sorts out grammar. It's great. Is that true? Is what is Grammarly? And there are competitors available, but is AI correction? What is it good at, and what can't it do? What's your
Yeah.
take on it, Paul?
I'm not against it. I embrace technology as it comes and try to integrate it into what I do with my students and what they can do with it. And Grammarly is useful, let's face it. If it can notice things, well, first of all, if you're on your own, if you're writing on your own, you don't have access to your coach or your tutor to check your final draft of something. And I always recommend grammar. Let's pay attention to that in later drafts of a piece. If you're on your own, Grammarly is useful. It's going to notice things with fresh eyes, so to speak, which is what an editor does or a coach. We see the writing with fresh eyes. It's going to notice things you don't as the writer. It's going to be able to offer corrections and even some suggestions, but based on the AI standard that it knows. And this is where I think its limit appears. Grammarly and AI, so far, can't replicate that dexterity we were talking about earlier, that ability to twist and turn the language creatively, even in academics. I work with some great academic writers who write fantastic, engaging, really dry scientific papers, but they're able to twist and play with the language in a way that's engaging and sometimes even entertaining while discussing molecules. Grammarly is not going to do that for you. It's not going to build you a beautiful sentence. It's going to tell you when, according to the corpus of grammar reference that it can access, that structure is wrong. But it's not going to tell you how to take that structure and twist it so it just expresses something a little different that's unique to you. And for me, that's the goal of writing. Even if you're writing the paper about molecular structure of this new material, which could be very boring or it could be fascinating, depending on how you write it.
Sure. And
So I think that's the limit.
on the other side of things, if you've got fast and loose social media writers and copywriters, Grammarly's not going to be liking those ands and buts starting a sentence and
Yeah, that's
your
right.
sentence fragments, is it? I think it does a lot of things well and a lot of things not well. And the problem with Grammarly is it's marketing. They give this message of like, we'll fix your grammar. It's like, can grammar really be fixed so that it's just one thing correct or incorrect? Not
Yeah,
necessarily. I think what it does well is it's a great proofreader. So switch it on after you've done your final sort of check through, and it might find
yeah,
those typos and sort of tense errors and things. One thing that it's really bad at is if you have it switched on throughout your writing process, it is going to crush your confidence. It does for me, it
yeah,
does for everyone. You get red lines under everything when
yeah,
it's saying, hey, should that comma be there? What is that the tense that you meant to write? AI doesn't understand writing or reading intention.
yeah,
That's why it cannot categorically ever give suggestions based on style and the natural sound of things, and maybe the best or most effective way to phrase a sentence or a paragraph, it can only give you, as Paul said, suggestions based on its, you know, LLM, based on its large language model. So I recommend,
Yeah.
yeah, it's great to use, but please, for everyone out there, don't believe the marketing message that it will fix everything for you. Would
And
love
does
to know.
Grammarly recognize? Sorry, Phil, go ahead.
I was just going to say to everyone, add your, if you're a Grammarly user, a lover, hater, or, what you think about it, just add it in the comments as well. We'd love to, we'll
Yeah.
get to those in a bit. Sorry, Paul.
I was just going to add, like, does Grammarly know, like you said, the intention? Does it know that you're writing copy or an essay for school or a piece of creative fiction, right? Because if you want to start a sentence with "but" for emotional impact, you're free to do that in fiction writing and literature and poetry. And Grammarly tells you that's an error. It's going to crush that license you should feel, especially as a creative writer.
Also,
It can't recognize that.
if you did put these categories into Grammarly and said, "Hey, this is copywriting," you're going to get what ChatGPT does, which is like hack copywriting, which is, this is
Yeah,
how to write copy. It's going to use the same old tired phrases. It's going to be unoriginal. And by the end of this year, the web will be flooded with
yeah.
this kind of ineffective writing, I think. So the more you try and categorize things with AI, the less fluidity and creativity you have. And really, we pay attention to difference, not to the same.
That's
So
right.
that's why, circling back to grammar, that's why it's great to have a good handle on it and to be able to move things around and use it in a creative way.
Like pronunciation, where you can emphasize a word with tone and stress. I want to be able to do that with grammar too. I want to create different emotional impacts with the same grammar structure by having some command over grammar. It's a tool. It's a language. It's a piece of your toolkit.
Yeah, just looking for some comments here. We've had some great comments in. Thanks, Jürgen. Yasmin has a comment here. Totally agree with the difference between terminology and grammar dexterity. Yeah, that's something we talked about a little bit earlier, before we got onto the topic of Grammarly. Yeah, great. Okay, so thanks for those. We'll get to your questions. So if you've got any, just write them in. Right, Paul, moving on. We talked about Grammarly and why grammar is important. Now, for the next big question, what can we do to improve grammar? I think this applies to everyone watching, whatever your first language is. What is a good approach to improve grammar? We don't want to study
Yeah.
those boring, crusty textbooks, do we?
Yeah, I was going to say there's always the boring, crusty textbooks. Especially if you're on your own or you're in a country where you don't have access to the English books, yeah, they can help you. I'm always asked by students, should I watch English movies? I would say, yeah, it's not going to hurt. But bear in mind, if you're watching a gangster film, it's written so that they use gangster English, and gangsters tend not to be highly educated users of the language. So they're going to have slang, they're going to have irregularity. So you have to recognize what you're seeing and hearing. It's not going to hurt, but it's not necessarily the ideal way. I don't think there is an ideal way. I think you need to learn grammar any way you can, including the boring, crusty textbooks, if that's all you have. But for my money, nothing replaces reading. Reading is where I got my grammar knowledge. Yes, I studied it later in life, but it's also where I got my ability to speak. As a child, for the first 10 years of my life, I barely spoke. All I did was read. I was too withdrawn, too shy, too reserved to make friends and talk, but I read like crazy. And when I became, when I got a little older and wanted to make friends, wanted to get involved with things, suddenly, magically, I was able to talk. Where did that come from? It came from reading. The beautiful thing about reading is you're going to be exposed to such a huge variety of structures that it trains your brain to get comfortable with those structures, to see that dexterity we've been talking about in action. And especially once you've learned some grammar, whether it's in school or from a crusty, boring textbook, or from a coach or a teacher or an online course. There's lots of great YouTube teachers. I don't consider myself one of those grammar teachers because I don't really teach. I investigate grammar on my channel. There's lots of great YouTube grammar teachers you can learn the structures from. Then when you have that knowledge, the key is to apply it. Notice it in use, right? Read, and say, hey, why are they not using present perfect in that context? Or why are they using past perfect? What's the referent point that we're behind? Why is this story being narrated in simple present tense? Applying your knowledge to what you see. So, and then that reinforces and creates this cycle of adoption. I know a lot of young students, certainly the ones I work with, hate reading. And I got to be frank with them. I'll tell them, look, guys, if you expect to really achieve English proficiency, especially with things like grammar and structure, you never will unless you read. Reading, to a large extent, English is a language that's been passed down through the written word, much more than so than some languages that are verbally based or verbally transmitted languages. So there's lots of different ways, videos, textbooks, courses. Ultimately, it really comes down to reading it, seeing the examples. For me.
I mean, that's kind of my thinking as well. I prefer to reverse engineer rather than to give people all the nuts and bolts first and tell them to build a car or an IKEA wardrobe.
Yeah.
If we are reading great examples of the kind of work that we're trying to write, what should we be doing? How should we be reading that? What's your take on that? You mentioned earlier
a couple things,
drawing grammar out from these examples.
I guess it depends if you're in a class, working with a coach, or you're on your own. But what I would recommend my students do is read something for enjoyment. If it's a novel, read it for the story. Especially if it's in English and you've already read the book in your language, you know the story, you know how it ends. The great thing about stories for learning, even this works with cinema too. When you first encounter the story, your primary concern is what will happen to the characters. How does this end? Do Jack and Rose survive the Titanic and remain happily ever after? You wait 3 hours to find that out. Once you see that movie and you know how it ends, if you see it again, you don't care about the story. You start noticing other things, the cinematography, the lighting. You hear the music more vividly. Same thing with reading. If you read a Harry Potter novel, the first thing you're reading is what's going to happen with Harry and his pals. Read it again, and knowing the outcome, you don't care about that. You'll start to notice the language that's being used. So I like students to read things more than once. And the same thing with essays or articles. Read it for its point, its thesis, if you will, and then read it again, and the language is going to suddenly look a little bit more bright and stand out more. And that's when you can analyze it. And as far as concrete techniques, Phil, I would say things like writing notes, highlighting verbs. What I do on my live show is I take a sentence, and the first thing I always recommend is break it down to its parts. Identify the parts. One way students get lost in reading is they don't know where the main subject and the main verb are. And every sentence is going to have one of those. And that's going to be the primary focus. And if you lose track of that, you're gone. So
we're going to share just to jump in, but we're going to share a great tool on how to do that as well. We've got some, don't forget, we've got some sort of tools and sites we're going to share with you. And there's one which is, particularly great for that, so we can break things down.
Totally agree with that. And that's that inductive approach, taking the real life example of it, and as you said, reverse engineering it, and then seeing the structure at work. And it's especially effective if you already have some of the basic, the traditional grammar education of the basic rules, if you will. If you can tease it out and apply to what you already know, you can either see how it matches what you know or contradicts it. And then
Yeah,
what's
great.
the reason for that contradiction? So I really
100%.
prefer that method.
I mean, it's a real top tip to read twice, and the second time you're analyzing. Let's
Yeah,
break things down into not just grammar. There are other aspects too. You know, the rhythm,
absolutely.
the vocabulary, the um, even the length of sentences. Right? We can
For
really
sure.
notice all these, all
Pacing,
this,
rhythm.
all of these aspects. So
Yeah.
definitely breaking down that grammar, and that's why I'd say that the one. I mean, for me, I don't know if you agree, Paul, but the few grammar terms that it is worth having are the parts of speech. If you know them and what they
Totally.
are, pretty
Yeah.
handy, right?
Yeah. I
And
agree. Those are the building blocks.
by parts of speech, we mean adjectives, verbs, prepositions.
Yeah.
Are there 8? Is that right, Paul? Or is there more?
Depends on which textbook you refer to. I've
Okay.
heard 8, I've heard 12. Sometimes pronouns are also adverbs and all that overlaps. So,
All right.
yeah,
Well,
around that.
there's
There's a
several.
manageable number. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Let's have a quick look in the comments if there's any. Well, if you're still here, everyone, if you're enjoying this, just give us a thumbs up and let us know what your thoughts are about all of this.
Hmm.
About is that something you do? Do you read twice? Do you break down the different parts of speech to analyze and reverse engineer text? Is this completely new to you? It might be.
I'll tell you something. I learned that way when I was studying Japanese. In fact, I'll just show you this. They call them parallel textbooks. And they take a story, like a short story in Japanese, and there's the Japanese version, and then it's written in English. So you can read both versions, and you can compare the grammar that you encounter. Vastly different. But I read the story first in the English to catch the story, then read it in Japanese, and then I did the same technique on my own with the Japanese language. I'm teasing out the grammar and trying to make sense of it. So even if you're learning English grammar as a second or other language, it's great if you can read English that you've already read before in your language, and you know the story or you know the point of the article, if it's an essay or an article. Lots of great comments here. Wow.
I'm typing a comment myself, Paul, but I will get to them in a second.
Yeah.
Yeah, anything that's caught your eye?
It's a little far away from my old man eyes, but
I've put you on the spot there, haven't I? Well, I'll
yeah,
get back to them. All right, comments.
lots though.
Yes, Eunice had an interesting point about AI. I think I showed this one earlier, but worth bringing up. Thanks for that, Eunice. He says it helps if you put it in a specific context. For example, if there's a grammar specifically used in academic or scientific contexts. Yeah, I mean, AI is definitely improving, and if you prompt it, I'm sure you can get better results. Agree with that.
Again, it's a
Babatunde,
tool, right?
yeah, for sure. Babatunde says, do audiobooks work as well as text for trying to understand grammar? Interesting one.
Yeah. In my own
What's
case, I
prob-
think it's a bit of a problem. I find I love audiobooks, but I find it a bit ephemeral. It's hard to catch. So you can't write notes on it. It's
hard to listen
unfolding in real
twice.
time. Yeah. So it doesn't really lend itself to that analysis where you can do with you can do with a document. You can scribble notes on it, and it stops right in front of you. A document until you turn the page, it's stopped. But an audiobook is running. So I find audiobooks a little bit more challenging than written for that kind of analysis work. But again, it's exposure. So it's better than nothing, right? It's
For
great to
sure.
have endless exposure.
Let's turn our attention to these tools then. We said we'd give these
Yeah.
top grammar tools. I've got these ready queued up. So once we've finished talking about them, I'll add them in the chat in LinkedIn and YouTube. And don't forget as well, I've got a very cool sheet. I'll give you a sneak peek in a minute with 60 plus tools on it all kinds of great links and help for writers. So stick around for that one at the end. Paul, what are your top sites, top ways to learn or improve grammar? What are we
Yeah.
talking about here?
Well,
I think the first one that you had mentioned was daily grammar. Tell us about that.
yeah, daily grammar is good. Well, it sort of gives you examples to ponder on a daily basis. I'm not sure. Are we bringing those up on screen, Phil? No, I don't think so.
I'm not going to bring up on screen because
Yeah,
we haven't planned that. But what I promise to
that's
do
okay.
is we'll put them in the
Yeah.
we'll put them in the comments so everyone will be able to see them.
I really like daily grammar for Twitter, following it on Twitter, because it's going to give you a daily sample of an interesting turn of phrase or an interesting use of grammar. And again, this is that exposure we're looking at. And they're bite-sized little examples, so you can do your little daily analysis, your daily investigation, find out what is the sentence doing. And, notice how it makes you feel. What's the emotional expression that's poured through this grammar? I like daily grammar for that. I find it entertaining.
I like
And useful.
you can get it by email too, right? And I like the fact it's like it fits in with your lifestyle because there's infinite information out there. But if you can have one thing which is just giving you that mental jogging your mind, saying
Yeah.
just maybe once a week you look at it, maybe twice a week, you're going through these little mini lessons and mini bits of help. I find it
great.
really motivating.
Yeah. I mean, even native English speakers like us, I crave input. I crave new sentence structures that I've never seen before. And not to be a hypocrite, but I read a lot less at my age now than I did when I was younger. Too many time demands. So having those bite-sized inputs, it's very, very helpful.
That's great. Then the next one, just to move on, Paul. The next one I'm going to share on screen because I've got it up here, and I think it's worth taking a very quick look at. It's parts of speech. Partsofspeech.info. There are lots of sites where you can paste text in, and it will break it down. It will give you the parts of speech, or there's even more complex ones that will give you all kinds of stats and cool information on the language. But if I just hit tag it with the parts of speech, we get it color coded about what in that sentence is a noun, is a number, is a verb. And if there's a particular sentence or passage that you want to look at, is a really quick visual way just to break it down. The great thing about this is, once you start to use it, you'll begin to notice all of these things without necessarily pasting it. But I think that one's super useful for dragging out the grammar of sentences. So check that one out.
Mm-hmm. I think that is fantastic, and I didn't know about it until recently. But that's doing exactly what you and I have been discussing, that inductive analysis, or what I call it, investigation of a sentence. And it gives everyone the tools to do that. I think that's probably more helpful than any AI, any kind of Grammarly type system, because it's teaching you how to recognize those parts.
I suppose in a way it's what Grammarly uses to do its job, to say, hey, that's wrong, or these two words don't go together. But for me, Grammarly is doing it the wrong way around. It's saying, hey, you've made this error. It's like, well, how do I know how to improve so I don't get this error? How do I know how to improve so I can write more effectively? That's what we want. And yeah, it takes a bit more work. But for me, Grammarly is a proofreader.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it has its place.
What's your third tool, Paul?
It's something similar, but I love this text inspector, textinspector.com. Mm-hmm. And it again does something a little bit like the parts of speech. It's going to analyze a piece of text or inspect it. I like the word inspect because it fits my grammar detective motif of the investigation or the inspection. I think in the UK, police detectives are called inspectors rather than investigators or detectives. So it's the same process. It's looking at a piece of language and analyzing it. And I'm convinced that's the best way to learn grammar, especially if you've already learned grammar the old way. You have some knowledge of it, or through exposure and being immersed, you've adopted a fair fluency or proficiency in grammar. It's great to use the knowledge to analyze what you see. The great thing about grammar is that it's a foundational architecture, but there are millions and millions, probably infinite, variations on those structures. And there isn't like 3 different sentence structures that you have to master. There's infinite. Like recently someone asked me about conjunctions. How many conjunctions am I allowed to use in a sentence? And I said, well, if you want to write a 2,000-page sentence, you theoretically could. And you could have hundreds of conjunctions. So it's about command of the tools. So I like both parts of speech, text inspector. They're kind of doing similar things, but I think they're both fantastic, and they facilitate this inductive approach.
Awesome. And your last one is a sort of grammar universe, grammar girl, right? Podcasts, websites,
Yeah,
books, lots of bite-sized information.
yeah. She's fantastic. You can see her on LinkedIn. I see her posts almost daily. She has a great podcast. And she offers things like etymology, the origins of a grammar piece or a particular use. So it's really,
Great.
really quite fascinating, especially if you're a teacher of some
I
kind.
think I think she's called Mignon Fogarty. Maybe I'm getting that wrong,
Fogarty,
but
yeah.
something like that. She's got courses on LinkedIn, and I'm sure
Yeah.
you can sign up to get sort of emails and stuff from her as well. So recommend it. And here are all those links, plus a little bonus from me, which
All
is
right.
one that you might not know about. I'll just hit post. One that you might not know about is the Language Nerds, which is a website, and they've got all kinds of social media, Facebook, Instagram. I don't know if they're on LinkedIn or not, but lots of funny memes about grammar. And funnily enough, you learn quite a lot about how languages interact and why certain aspects of English are weird or funny. So definitely recommend checking out the Language Nerds as well and following them wherever they go.
Great sources, great links. Yeah.
Let's get to answering some questions.
Yeah.
Just before we do, I'm going to give a quick plug to this worksheet that I was talking about. So here's a picture of indeed what I'm talking about. I have, I'll just make it a little bit bigger, but not so big that you can just see all of the cool tools on it. I've got a tools sheet that I've put together for writers, especially for multilingual writers. It is a mega sheet, as it says there. It's got 60 plus links to dictionaries, language help, text analysis tools, some of the things we were talking about, plus tons more. So if you want that, simply send me a DM. You can comment in the comments if you like, and I'll get back to you and I will send it to you. So just comment mega if you want that, or just message me and say, hey, Phil, just reaching out to get this list of resources because it's super useful. And it's not something that I publish, so I'm just giving it out to people who are attending today. If anyone's watching on Paul's YouTube channel, you can get in touch via my email. Okay, and I think Paul will post that after we finish. Wonderful. Hope. I'm seeing lots of megas in the chat. It's coming your way, Laurie. Although I am super busy this weekend, so it may be a little bit later. I'll get to everyone when I can. But yeah, just comment mega if you want it. And yeah, questions. I'm going to scroll through the comments to see what questions we have. Time for you to.
I saw an interesting one by Jürgen, I believe, about the modern trend of writing as short and simple as possible. Do you see that one? Jürgen
That does sound
Winter,
interesting. Yeah, I'm just scrolling down to try and find Jürgen's comment. Is it a recent one, or did he?
It says 840.57 to me.
Sorry, say again.
before
What, dot 57?
8:40:57 is the time.
Right.
8:40:50
Okay, so
on my,
fairly recently.
yeah, it's before the links. It's like 3 or 4
Got
before
it.
the links.
Got it. Oh, here we are. Sorry for the wait, dear audience. What about the modern trend of writing as short and simple as possible? Does it make grammar less important? Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah,
What's
great
your
question.
What's your idea, Paul?
I kind of think, I mean, I'm always recommending short and concise. That's the beauty of English. It's not a verbose language, right? But I think that places a higher demand on grammar because you've got to force more meaning into fewer words, right? So it almost makes it more of a grammatical challenge to make sure that the meaning you intend is communicated through that shorter expression. And yes, we do this, right? Text messaging, all across social media. This has influenced our language. But I'm sure you've all experienced social media messages that may or may not cause the reaction the reader intended. I've gotten angry at messages that weren't intended to be angering me. I've been offended. I've been, I've been, I've interpreted some short messages as requests that weren't requests, and this is because the grammar is somehow not being used in a way that communicates that. So it's a new challenge, but I don't think it makes grammar less important. I think it maybe makes it more important. I don't know how to measure that, but
That's a good point. I mean, I think the very short and concise writing that we often see online is people who have mastered the art of a particular form of communication. So you can definitely learn just from osmosis of being around a platform, with very short form writing, of in terms of what works. But I have to say, yes, I agree with Paul. I think it makes it more important because we really need to know what to cut and how to cut it.
yeah,
I work with so many people who are like Portuguese speakers, Spanish speakers, and they don't always know that you can cut prepositions, that you can rearrange a sentence to reduce 40% of the words and it will be better. And
yeah,
so I think how you do that is what the real expertise is, and that's what we should be aiming for as
yeah.
writers.
That's a great question.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Jürgen. I'm looking for another question. I saw one about here we go. There's another one. Paul, maybe you can answer this one. Is there a
Yeah,
difference between the grammar of British and American English, or is there no difference?
this is a good question. And just to clarify, I'm Canadian, although I live in the Americas. I don't consider myself American. And as such, Canada is much more affected in our education system by the British culture of education than the Americans. We used to be a British colony. So our education system follows the model of Britain's. Some people are going to be upset when I say this. I also believe the Canadian and British education systems are superior to the American, the US. The US has a serious problem with public school systems because they're based on tax base and economy of a local region. It's not nationalized. Some people get a good education, some don't. Also, the emphasis in America, the US, is on economy, making money, rather than erudition or education. So there is a little difference. American English favors brevity, it favors simplicity, and if it can figure out a way to communicate something without a bunch of grammar nuance, it will. Now, that's a generalization, and it may not be fair because, of course, there are great schools in the US, there are great, brilliant minds and people in the US, and great communicators and writers, obviously. But as a generalization, I think there is a difference that we see. For example, in the US, if you're a sports fan, you see a lot of sports, a lot of people in the industry of sports who aren't great communicators grammatically. They're very great communicators emotionally, maybe with body language, but you'll hear some very strange grammar if you watch sports. You'll hear strange grammar in movies. Now, part of that's education, part of it's just the culture of simplifying the language in a multicultural environment. I would say there's no difference between Canadian and British English because we follow the same textbooks. We defer to the Cambridge and the Oxford dictionaries. But when you talk about the US, there tends to be a difference. As a Canadian, I have to admit, sometimes what I hear from American mouths really annoys me, makes my skin crawl. I have to admit that.
I'll
But
let you take all the flak for this one, Paul. I'll
yeah,
put
I
my
will.
two pence in here, which is that,
Please.
I mean, without getting into the complex cultural backgrounds of, you know, Britain and America and the different sort of cultural influences we have on our language, I think it's often confusing to learners that I think, for example, Spanish, it has a greater difference between some of the grammar and some of the
Yeah.
words used between Latin America and Spain. English, I think, really the big difference is vocabulary, right? We're talking about cookies versus biscuits and sidewalk versus pavement. Grammar-wise, there's not a huge difference.
That's right.
It's like small differences in the present perfect and things like that. So I don't think it's one to worry about. But
Yeah.
make sure your work is accurate, right? If you're writing for an American audience, then you know, try to adhere to the principles and the style of that.
And if you're, let's say you're attending a university in the US, but you've grown up on American TV and sports, you want to avoid using things like ain't. That might be acceptable, conventionally speaking, in television or sports. It's not going to be conventionally accepted even in a US university.
Sure.
But I think in terms of the grammar, just let me give you a concrete example here. American English tends to favor brevity, even more so than British or Canadian. One great example is the present perfect with the verb get. According to the dictionary, get means to receive something, right? And if you receive something in the past and you currently possess it, we would say, I have got a new mouse. I received it in the past, yesterday at the store, and now I possess it. So, or to express possession, we say, I have something. In the US, they get rid of the auxiliary and just say, I got. In both cases, they'll say, yesterday at the store, I got a new mouse. Or they'll say, I got a problem. Or I got an idea. Meaning, I have an idea. They just get rid of the have and say, I got, instead of I've got. Or, we got great weather today. For me, that sounds really weird, but they've eliminated one word in favor of one.
Good point. But would that be used in writing, or is that a speaking thing? I mean,
It's predominantly a speaking thing,
it's mostly speaking, right?
but you'll sometimes see it in articles, certainly online stuff. It might
That's
slip
true.
past editors, but it's
mean, I don't know
predominantly a
about-
speaking thing.
I don't know about Canada, but we've got some terrible speaking habits. Well, not necessarily terrible, but different speaking habits in Britain as well. So
Yeah, it's also regional, right?
for sure. Right, we've got time for one more super quick question. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions, but we have to finish on time.
Yeah.
There's loads more questions coming in. Thanks
There's
for
so
those.
many.
We will get back to them in the chat. And thanks for coming, everyone, today. Just very quick last one is this. A question from Aishwarya says, what's one thing I can do to improve grammar daily while I'm at work? Thanks for that question.
I think
what do you
we've answered this question. If you don't have a lot of time to read, use one of those apps like Daily Grammar, and maybe even take the example you see in Daily Grammar and put it into the parts of speech analysis. This is the beautiful thing about this technology. We can get little doses of grammar education in our phone if we're intentional about it. Or if you have time, if you have a habit of reading the newspaper online or in print, find a sentence you don't understand, pour it into the app. It's going to break it down for you. You're going to learn something. But
Sure.
I think the theme here has been this inductive approach, reverse engineering approach. Get the exposure. Get a new sentence into your brain every day, however you do it.
I think you're already doing it, Aishwarya. If you're thinking about improving grammar daily, that's it.
Yeah.
It's just go for 10 minutes a day or half an hour a week, but make it the time that you dedicate, right? You won't find time down the back of the sofa. You gotta make that time happen. So
Yeah.
schedule it, and then whether you're using apps or working from a page in a book, if you've got a teacher, a mentor, a coach, maybe they'll tell you what you may want to work on too.
Yeah.
That is it, everyone. I can't believe how it's flown by. We didn't have time to
Incredible.
answer all your questions, but we will get back to you. Thanks so much for coming. And Paul, the grammar detective, thank you as well.
Thank you, Phil.
Everybody, flock to his YouTube channel and check out some of the great videos that he's got. Grammar Detective. Don't forget, I'll get back to you with those sheets for anyone who's commented mega, or just get in touch. You can always just reach out, connect, say hi to me. And then if your grammar question is too hard, I'll just ask Paul.
Yep. You can do that on my weekly live stream, Hard Boiled English Live. That whole show is just me and the whiteboard answering your questions live. So if something stumps you and you want an answer, you want to figure it out, check my show out. It's going to come back live, Phil, starting the first week of September. I'm on a weather break, but stay tuned for that. And that's on my YouTube channel where they can find everything.
Great. Thanks, everyone. I'll be back with another live session sometime next month. So keep your eyes on LinkedIn and socials for that. And yeah, thanks, everyone. Again, have an awesome weekend.
You too, Phil. Take care.